Project Capgras, a short story by Dylan Cairo. The lone and level sand stretched on in every direction as far as the eye could see, a sea of auburn orange speckled with black-red rocks that seemed to go on for eternity. My crew and I had landed on this planet 47 days ago, though days seemed to continuously become more and more difficult to keep track of, and the freezing nights were just as unpleasant. As far as we had been able to determine, the planet had an anomalously elliptical orbit, likely accounting for the timekeeping issues. Knowing this, of course, didn't actually help much with the jet lag-like symptoms it caused. The crew of the CAS Basilisk, the flagship cruiser of the Citadel's Armada and my ship of nearly 2 decades, had been called to the desert planet of Nekbet by a distress signal matching the signature of a colony ship that had disappeared over a century prior. The UHF Capgras of the United Humanity Fleet was the largest colony ship ever constructed and carried with it 50,000 colonists and a power core that could fuel an entire parsec for a century or more. It was bound for the verdant green and oxygen-rich planet of Aphelon. Needless to say, it never reached its destination. No ships have been made to match it, and no attempts have been made to reach Aphelon since. So why would a distress signal from a long-lost colony ship be emanating from a desolate and barren planet on the furthest edge of colonized space? Nekbet had been a mining planet 300 years ago, but had been abandoned by the Solaris group once it had been bled dry. Not even smugglers used it now because it was too far away from any major ports to be useful. No signs of life, human or otherwise, had been detected since Solaris left it to rot. Until now. Nekbet's sun, tinted slightly red by the planet's thick and iron-rich atmosphere, burned bright in the sky as we approached our 26th hour of consecutive daylight. My crew was getting restless. We brought enough rations to last us 6 months, and despite our quartermaster's assurances that we had plenty left, the meals lately had dipped significantly in both quality and portion size. Adding to our troubles, the air conditioning on the Basilisk landing unit had malfunctioned 10 hours ago, and the heat was beginning to get to everyone. No one more than our head officer of xenobiology, Sarasvati Shada, my twin sister. Padma, you can't seriously expect us to stay here. We haven't seen any signs of Capgras or anything for that matter. Face it, the signal was a glitch or something. We should head back to the Armada. Despite being my twin, Sarasvati stood at least head taller than me. Her straight sable hair pulled into a tight ponytail and her Armada-issued officer's jacket was tied into a knot around her waist. Her skin was just slightly paler than mine, not quite as tawny of a brown as she spent most of her days cooped up in a lab on the ship. Now, though, her arms were crossed as she stood outside the unit's hatch door, looking out incredulously over the sandy landscape. Sarah, I know the Basilisk systems inside and out, and you know as well as I do that there's way too advanced to generate a false distress call like that. Someone made that signal, someone who needs help. We need to find out who. Or what? Sarah muttered under her breath. Just then, the unit behind us started to beep loudly, a small red bulb blinking above the door. We turned our heads to see a tall, burly man with short, dark hair, in oil-covered overalls, coughing loudly and exiting the side hatch of the landing unit. He wiped his face with a rag on his belt, smearing the oil across his pudgy cheeks. He patted the side of the ship and sighed, stretching his back and waving us over. It was the ship's chief engineer, Chang Mingu. Chen had been born and raised in one of the junk worlds in the Shinji culture, and he often acted like a man who had just stepped off one of the junker mech fighting pits. But he was one of the most brilliant men I'd ever met and could fix any ship with a piece of loose string and a wad of chewing gum. "Captain," he called gruffly, his words obscured slightly by the large, bushy mustache that covered his mouth and his thick junker accent. "Did you manage to fix the AC, Officer Chen?" "Not just yet. It's being a real piece of work for me today. Capri picked something up on the scanner you need to see, though." My sister and I exchanged a look and then followed him back into the ship. The interior of Basilisk's landing unit broadly followed standard Armada guidelines. It had one central atrium with a large center console and various adjoining compartments that could be swapped out or shifted around depending on the crew's needs. But, of course, even a unit that followed protocol to the leather was bound to have a few quirks of its own. The rest of the crew had been with the ship nearly as long as I had, and they'd certainly left their mark on her. There wasn't an inch of her interior that wasn't dented or scratched in one way or another, and there were even a few crude drawings carved into places where someone thought they wouldn't be found. The Basilisk was one of the most decorated battle cruisers in the fleet, and had seen more combat than any one veteran ever had, serving in both the First and Second Solar Wars, and had more than her fair share of scars to prove it. Now, in peace times, the Basilisk had been retired to become a patrol and research vessel, sent out to investigate anomalies that were too dangerous or remote for standard Armada research vessels to investigate. But even in her retirement, she couldn't quite stay out of trouble. Our last assignment had seen us inspecting an asteroid that had recently been probed by the Magellan Corporation for mining. But every survey team they'd sent out had lost contact almost as soon as they touched down. It ended in a massive firefight against a crew of Praetorian slavers that resulted in the destruction of one of the Basilisk's escape pods. Thankfully, though, we were able to retrieve the surveyors relatively unharmed, and the entire crew got some shiny chest candy for our trouble. Speaking of the crew, Chen led us through the side hatch toward the central atrium. Most of them were already in attendance, huddled around the console at the center of the room. There was the navigator and chief technical officer Arastu Kepri, the chief officer of geology and the ship's co-pilot, Amir Fame, and the ship's medic, Tetsuo Ko. The Basilisk's primary pilot, Nicola Andrej, along with the rest of the lesser pilots that made up the Prime's skeleton crew, had remained on board Basilisk Prime in orbit in case of an emergency. Only one member was absent, but that wasn't too out of character for Zem, especially as of late, so I guessed and hoped they'd be joining us shortly. A large projection of a ship hovered over the dais in the center of the console, rotating slowly and shimmering and flickering slightly, and the hollow projector calibrated itself. Is that? Sarah stared, open-mouthed. Chen nodded. It's Capgras, all right. Well, I crossed my arms over my chest, staring incredulously at the engineer. Where is it? Well, it's, Chen swallowed, rubbing the back of his neck. It's about 8,000 kilometers away, Cap'n. What? I demanded. But we tracked the signal to right here. We should be right on top of it. Kepri stepped forward, inputting something into the thin tablet in his hands. He was a tall and thin man with a sphere-looking face, hair with more salt than pepper, and a dark, russet-colored skin. He graduated from the Citadel's Navigational Academy almost 30 years prior and had been transferred to the Armada 2 years into his assignment. He had always said he preferred quiet assignments, but I got the sense he secretly enjoyed the trouble we got into. Kepri sighed, swiping up on the display. That's exactly it, Captain. We are. The hologram projection of the Capgras shrank, zooming out to show the full scale and exactly where it was in reference to our unit. It seemed impossible. It should have been impossible, but there it was, clear as day. The Capgras was in the middle of the planet's hologram, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of pounds of solid rock. How is that even possible? Sarah's jaw dropped. Ignoring how a ship of that size could even get there, how could it not burn up with the pressure alone? It's got to be at least 10,000 degrees Kelvin, give or take a couple hundred degrees. As if on cue, she was interrupted by the entrance of the member of the crew who had been hitherto absent. The cook, quartermaster, ship's steward, first mate, and my longtime friend and confidant, Eider Nuinut. Eider was an Iraqian, an alien from the planet of Araki. It wasn't rare to have alien officers in the Armada, even though it was a largely human institution, but it also wasn't exactly common to have one in a crew that consisted entirely of humans, and it was especially rare for an alien to outrank the humans when it did happen. But Eider wasn't just any Iraqian. Zay had been my partner in the academy, and when I was placed on the Basilisk during the Urania Accords, I insisted Zay be placed with me. It wasn't just nepotism that earned Zem the assignment, though. Zay graduated third in our class, behind only me and another student who went on to become general in the Second Solar War. Zay'd been on my crew longer than anyone else, and had the scars to prove it. Notably, a particular gnarly one just under his neck from the blade of an Iranian rebel. Eider was always on the pricklier side of friendly, but ever since we landed on Nekbet, Zay'd been more irritable than usual. They were lashing out, and Tetsuo getting into fights with Fam. I even saw them getting into an argument with Kepri over whether or not the rations were provided were halal. They'd even started to shut me out, so I'll admit I was relieved to have them joining for us for this. Lieutenant, how kind of you to finally join us. And thank you so much for your expertise in this planet's geological makeup. I'm sure no one else here could have provided that. Fame crossed his arms and drawled sarcastically. I shot him a warning look, and he shrunk under my gaze. Fame was a short and well-built man with tan skin and dark eyes who kept his hair coiffed and his beard perfectly trimmed. He was vain, but he wasn't afraid to admit it, and that, at least, I could respect. He was lounging in a chair he must have dragged from his lab into one of the adjoining compartments. That I respected slightly less. Idir clicked your mandibles irritably, but said nothing further to Fame's prodding, so at least they were trying to keep a cool head for the moment. Idir, I nodded to them, smiling slightly. If you had something to add, I'd appreciate your input. They nodded, then stepped forward, Zir bottom pair of arms pushing them away from the wall they were leaning on, Zir top pair, while Zir top pair stared crossed in front of them. Ider made Zir way up to look at the dais and pointed one long segmented finger at the holographic model of the ship. Look at it. Yeah, it's the Capgras. It's fucking weird. We've established this already. Fame rolled his eyes. Ider bristled in annoyance but continued. Really look at it, Dr. Fame. It's not just near the center of the planet. It's in the exact center. Fame sat forward in his chair, his eyes widening in realization. I sighed and pinched my brow. And for those of us without a PhD in geology, what does that mean, Fame? You're not suggesting. Fame glanced at Idir, ignoring my question entirely. You've been complaining about your readings the entire time we've been on the surface. You weren't able to pick up any tectonic or geothermal activity. Why do you think that is, Doctor? Zay cocks your head slightly. Fame? Explain, I ordered, now getting slightly irritated about being excluded from the unspoken conversation my two subordinates seemed to be having. Nekbet doesn't have a core. The Capgras is the core. The crew stared in shocked silence for a good couple of seconds before Sarah finally broke it. No, that just doesn't make any sense. Capgras only went missing 100 years ago. Nekbet is billions of years old. And wouldn't Solaris have noticed something if there was a ship in the core of the planet? Solaris's mining operations never went too far past the planet's crust, and the sensors they had 300 years ago weren't nearly as advanced as the ones we've got now, Kepri started. Stop. What? We're entertaining the idea that the Capgras was here 200 years before it was even built? Sarah cut him off. Either side, pinching their fingers between the chitinous ridge of their brow. I didn't say it made sense. I'm just pointing out what the sensors say. The proof is right there, clear as day. Just looked at them, dumbfounded. Do you even hear yourselves? What, are we entertaining the idea of time travel now? Kepri shrugged. Anything's possible. Sarah, I sighed, taking a step towards her. They've got a point. The proof is right there. But what if it's a glitch or a lie? She pleaded. Our sensors are carefully calibrated. It would take someone who knew them inside and out to fake something like this. Even Kepri doesn't know them that well. Why are you acting like this is so normal? I shook my head. Sarah, you just need to understand. No, Padma, you're the one who's not understanding. This has got to be a trap or something, but there's no way that ship can exist. If you want to get yourself killed going after it, then you'll what, Sarasvati? I said coolly. I'll head back to the ship. I'll call Citadel Command and let them know that you're unfit for duty. I'll have you removed from your post. Then go. What? I said go. You're relieved from duty, Officer Shada. She looked at me like I was joking. Padma, you can't seriously believe this is more important than what? Sarah, what could possibly be more important than this? 50,000 colonists from 100 different planets under the Citadel's control, all trapped in cryogenic stasis for 100 years. They could be alive, Sarah. Do you have any idea what that could mean for us? She stepped forward, grabbing me by the shoulders and shaking me lightly. Or they could be 100 years dead. You'd be risking your life for nothing. Again. Padma, you swore to me after last time. I cut her off. You're not talking me out of this, Sarah. Her eyes fell and her hands dropped away from my shoulders. Fine. Be the hero, Padma. That's all you ever cared about anyways. She turned away but shot me one last icy look before she did. But don't expect me to be there to pick up the pieces again. I won't be there when you break. I'm done. I thought about asking her to stay, ordering her to stop acting like such a damn child. Instead, I turned my back to her, staring past the hologram of Capgras at the far wall. Chen, can you help me get the shuttle ready? I'll get a message to Citadel Command once I reach Basilisk Prime. Chen shot me a questioning look and nodded. I'll get right on that, Doc. My sister glanced back at the hologram, hovering and flickering, pretty as a fruit on a vine. Then she walked towards the door to the shuttle bay and disappeared around the corner. She was gone. I didn't bother to watch Sarah's shuttle leave the atmosphere. I knew if Chen got his calibrations right, and he always did, she'd reach Basilisk Prime within the hour. It would take a little longer for Citadel Command to retrieve her message, but in the meantime, she'd be up on the ship, categorizing her samples and talking to Andre and the other members of the biology corps. Within a day or so, an unmanned retrieval vessel would arrive to pick her up and bring her to the nearest Citadel way station, at which point she'd give her testimony about how it was no longer fit to be captain of the Basilisk. But by then I knew it'd already be too late. We'd either return to the Citadel space, having rescued tens of thousands of colonists and be hailed heroes for centuries to follow, or I didn't like to think about the or. Either way, the next time I saw my sister would be a long way off, if I ever saw her again. I turned away from the hologram that I'd been staring at for the last hour or so and turned to face my crew. All right, where do we start? Capri spoke up. It would be dangerous, but it could be possible to teleport a small reconnaissance team to the ship's coordinates to survey the damage, then set up a larger-scale operation to retrieve the colonists. Eider clicks your mandibles thoughtfully. Something like that would require an extreme level of precision. If you're off by so much as a millimeter, you could risk splicing anyone who goes in. Well, Capri, I crossed my arms. Can you make it happen? He hesitated. Well, I should think. I could. I raised an eyebrow. Yes, Captain, I can do it. You can count on me. He nodded. I looked at the rest of my crew, letting the veneer of confidence slip slightly. Eider is right, though. This could be dangerous, and I can't guarantee that anyone who joins me will make it back. I can't in good conscience order any of you to undertake this mission, but just know that if you do, whatever comes, you're already a hero in my book. Eider stepped forward, a look of raw determination in your wide, compound eyes. I've followed you into Gehenna before, Captain. You haven't failed me yet. Tetsuo, who had remained quiet thus far, came forward next, their pale eyes soft and their hands crossed over their navel. They were the oldest member of the crew, having graduated from the academy over 50 years before Eider and I had. Still, they were fit for their age, and I'd never had a more skilled medical officer. I served 2 tours in the Necronetic Wars in the Terra Firma Division on Praetor. I'd be honored to join you on this mission, Captain Shada. I nodded, the shadow of a smile crossing my lips. 3 should be enough. Any more and me risk overloading the teleporter. As for the rest of you, I steeled myself. If we don't radio back to you within 6 hours, I want you to take the remaining shuttles and return to Prime without us. But Captain, Fame protested, shooting up from his chair. That wasn't a request, Amir. That was an order. I shot him a stony look that sent him back to his seat. Captain, Capri started tentatively. You know we'll support you no matter what, but are you really sure about this? Honestly? No, Doctor, I'm not. But we answered the distress signal. If there are people trapped down there waiting for us, we have to do everything in our power to help them, no matter the risk. Capri nodded, and I found my gaze drifting back to the floating hologram. I did my best to ignore the sinking feeling in the pit of my chest and the nagging at the edge of my mind. We were going to save those people. We were going to be heroes. We would do the right thing, no matter how wrong it felt in my gut. Eider, Tetsuo, and I stood on top of the teleportation platforms in the engineering unit, preparing for our trip down to the Capgras. Tetsuo had changed out of their medical fatigues and was dressed in a way I'd never seen before. They had donned a suit of heavily reinforced combat armor, heavily damaged with a deep black gash across the front from their time fighting necromorphs in the war. 2 large Omega Blasters, not standard Armada issue, were strapped to their sides, along with a massive assault rifle with a mounted flashlight on their back. Eider was dressed in leathers that I recognized to be traditional scout armor from Zir home planet. They had a large carbonate saber in a sheath on Zir back and an outdated-looking revolver on Zir hip. I'd seen them use both during training at the Academy and during the Accords, before the 2 Solar Wars, and I knew they were better than almost any human swordsman or gunslinger. I had to admit, they looked pretty good. For my part, I wore a suit of gray proto-neutronian armor that I had been awarded following my achievements during the Second Solar War. Acts of Valor was what they called it. Not that anything about that war felt particularly valorous. From where I stood, it was all just blood and ash by the end. My hip holster held my pistol, and on my back was my rifle, also equipped with a small flashlight and an extra battery pack. All 3 of us also had our communicators strapped firmly to our hips so we could easily reach them whenever we would need to. Perhaps we were over-prepared, but it was better to plan for the worst and end up over-encumbered than plan for the best and end up, well, dead. Fame was back at the central atrium, monitoring the position of Basilisk Prime in case the crew needed to make an emergency exit. Kepri and Chen were stationed behind the control panel, carefully calibrating the device. For this to work, everything had to be perfect. If they were off by even a hair, any or all of us could end up teleported straight into solid rock, or worse, with our atoms disambiguated and scattered to the vacuum of space. Finally, though, Kepri gave us a thumbs up and Chen booted up the activation sequence. The apparatus above our heads, a large structure consisting of 4 concentric circles, began to whir and spin, groaning slightly from its general lack of use. Teleportation was convenient, but put a huge strain on our energy stores. Even with Nekbet's long and clear days to soak up solar power, a jump like this took hours worth of solar energy. I did find it strange, though. It didn't protest nearly as much as I expected. As far as I was aware, it hadn't been used at all for the entire duration of our stay on the planet's surface. But there wasn't so much as a speck of dust on it. If I didn't know any better, I'd almost think it had been used recently. But I did know better, so I ignored my gut instinct and focused on the familiar tingling beginning to spread from my extremities. It was then that I noticed something in Chen's dark eyes. It was a strange look, and one I didn't recognize at first. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe he was just pulling a face to cheer me up before we set off. The tips of my fingers and toes started to become numb, and then the feeling, or lack thereof, started to spread to the rest of my body. My body started to flicker, becoming incorporeal as my atoms were severed from my cosmic coordinates. And that was when the realization hit me. I looked back at Chen and recognized the look in his eyes. I don't know how I saw it, but somehow I knew at that moment the engineer was experiencing an intense sense of deja vu. Before I had the chance to contemplate what that could mean, there was a bright flash, and 3 of us vanished entirely from the room. When I opened my eyes, all I saw was darkness. Thick, suffocating darkness. Except it wasn't a cold darkness that you'd expect from a cave. The air was hot and moist, and I could feel it clinging to my skin like cobwebs. And then as my eyes began to adjust, I realized it wasn't a true darkness. It wasn't the dark of a cave or the dark of a space when you're drifting through a void. No. Instead, I started to notice a soft red glow, barely visible, and yet it seemed to shine from every direction at once. Maybe it's the ship's emergency lights. I could hear Tetsuo's breathing beside me, and I could just barely make out the sound of Eider's clicking mandibles, but when I turned my head to look at either of them, all I could see were shadows against the red that surrounded us. "Eider," I croaked. My throat felt raw and dry, and my voice was scratchy and broken. It felt like I'd been screaming, but I couldn't remember so much as raising my voice. I could taste the air now, and the moisture seemed to coat my tongue and leave a slightly metallic aftertaste. It tasted like copper. It tasted like blood. I slowly and carefully felt down the side of my body, palming for where I knew my flare should be on my hip, in a specially designed holster. Empty. I reached for my pistol's holster next, feeling my heart rise to my throat. Also empty. My mouth went dry as my eyes continued to adjust to the darkness, and I realized the red glow wasn't coming from everywhere. It was coming from me. I looked down at my body and realized in horror that it wasn't the air that clung to me. Instead, thin white tendrils like the threads of a mycelium network were slowly working their way up my body, glowing that faint red. I tried to move my feet, but they were stuck fast, held in place by a thick web of tendrils that had grown up and enveloped my boots entirely. How long have I been down here? Where are the others? I thought to myself. The panic began to rise in my throat. Eider! Ko! I called out, tugging uselessly on the stuff that covered my feet. My heart started to race, and I felt as though it would burst right out of my chest. My system flushed with adrenaline, and finally, my eyes adjusted well enough to the space that I now inhabited. My surroundings came to sharp focus, and I felt my heart sink as I realized I wasn't in a ship. I wasn't in anything even resembling a ship. The rocky walls of the cave stretched up around me for at least 100 feet, disappearing into the darkness above me. Nearly every inch of the walls was covered with those same thin tendrils, pulsing with the same red light. I followed the tendrils with my eyes, and they seemed to grow thicker the higher up they got. The pulses grew stronger, more rhythmic. It reminded me of a human heartbeat. I couldn't see their apex as they reached into the darkness over my head, but I could almost feel it, a wet, dripping mass suspended just out of sight. I looked up and felt something hot and sticky hit my eye. It dripped down my face, and I could feel the path it left. It seemed to almost burn into my skin, like acid. I opened my mouth, maybe to scream, maybe to cry out in disgust, but as I did so, I realized all I could do was gag as the threads pushed over my chin and past my lips, reaching straight down into my esophagus. It tasted like meat. I retched, but that only thing to invite the thing further. I grasped frantically for my hips, searching for my communicator, hoping whatever had taken my flares and weapons might have at least missed that. Best case scenario, Tetsuo and Eider were dead. Worst case, I didn't want to think about worst case scenario. Either way, I needed to warn the rest of the crew. I needed to tell them get the fuck off this planet. Warn them that something had interfered with our scanners. That this was all some sort of fucked up mistake, or Sarah was right and it was a trap. I needed to tell them to get the Armada to nuke the shit out of Neckbet, so whatever this was couldn't spread to other planets, so this couldn't grow bigger than it already was. But once again, I found my compartment to be empty. I glanced to my side and saw it, breaking up the monotonous red glow. A softly blinking blue light. It was so close. If I could just bend over, I know I could just... I reached, straining my fingers towards the blue light, and that's when the world went sideways. I lost my balance and was falling, choking further on the growth as my back impacted the floor of the cave. I let out a strangled gasp as my back hit the ground, groaning against the intrusion in my throat. My feet were still planted firmly to the ground, so my knees were forced to bend uncomfortably as I stared up at the dark ceiling of the cave. And once again, my calm was just out of reach. I struggled, but I couldn't move my body, and the growths were beginning to spread over my arms as well. My eyes darted around the room, looking for any hope of escape, and that's when I noticed them. Concentrated on the far wall was a collection of large, fleshy masses. Some were small and shriveled up, decrepit, barely hanging onto the walls by the webs that supported them, but others looked healthy, almost pink, and they pulsed in time with the tendrils that enveloped them. Most of the healthy-looking ones were nondescript, just amorphous blobs that looked more like slabs of meat than anything else, but there were a few that had bits exposed. The white or pink meat peeled away ever slightly to reveal a scrap of clothing or a limb or a face. One face in particular. Its eye sockets were empty, and the chitin that covered its cheeks had been worn away, leaving it looking gaunt and thin. It must have been dead for 4 or 5 months at least, and at this point, only the exoskeleton remained. But its face was unmistakable, and the scar on Zir neck was proof of Zir identity. Eider was dead, and Eider had been dead for a while. My body went numb from the realization, and I couldn't even struggle as the webs began to grow over and envelop my torso. I heard something shift beside me, but I couldn't even turn my head to look anymore. It sounded almost like footsteps, except it was heavy. It sounded like something was being dragged across the ground. I almost hoped it was Tetsuo, injured but alive, coming to save me from this hell, but deep down, I knew it wasn't them. Ko was dead, but how long they'd been dead was impossible to say. How could I know if even my own memories were lying to me? The footsteps drew closer and more coordinated until it was standing right over me. The thing started to take shape in the darkness until all at once I was looking at a shadow of myself, grinning down at me with teeth. My teeth. It was hard to make out the shapes against the darkness, but it looked like me. It was me. There were too many teeth. I tried to count them as it smiled down at me, but I had to stop when I reached 50. And its eyes were all wrong. The right shape, the right color, sure, but they bulged and seemed to bubble like a blister that was ready to pop. It wore my armor, but in the places where flesh should have been metal or fabric, it just continued. It just melded into its flesh. It reminded me of men I'd seen melted into their exosuits, where the carbon of their armor fused with the carbon of their skin, turning them into part plastic monstrosities. Only those men always screamed before they died, and this thing wasn't screaming. It bent over and picked up my comm, and as it did so, the tendril seemed to shrink away from its fingertips. It brought up the communicator to its lips, stretched too wide over too many teeth. It didn't open its mouth, but somehow it began to speak. Hey guys, we're headed back. It's pretty bad down here. Worse than we thought. Those colonists are going to need more help. Maybe even more ships. It's hard to say. The static wasn't coming from the communicator. It was coming from the thing itself, and that wasn't my voice. I wanted to scream or vomit, but I could do neither, as the thing that wasn't me looked down at me with something like morbid fascination. Kepri's voice came over the comm, and I struggled harder, begging for him to hear me, but it was no use. Yes, Captain, we'll have the teleporter calibrated to your current position and get you back up here ASAP. That's not me. That's not my voice. That's not my face. I tried to scream, but my mouth was all tendrils now, and I could barely even breathe through the ones that had begun to worm their way up my nostrils. Out of the darkness, 2 more figures emerged. It was Ko, or something that was wearing their face, and it was the thing that wasn't either. The 3 of them looked down at me, but when they moved, they did so in perfect unison, even matching each other's breaths. I felt the edge of my vision darken as the threads stretched past my temples, going over my eyebrows and digging past my eyelids. The thing that wasn't me smiled down at me, and its form began to flicker and fade. Then there was a flash of bright light, and everything went dark.